The motion before us, that the evidence for prehistoric violence, skeletal remains showing 10 to 15% of adult males died violently, tells us less about the past than it does about what we need the past to have been. At the table, three minds approaching the question from different angles. The empiricist, who will not let us mistake a pattern in the data for a pattern in the world, and who asks what we actually know versus what we have assembled from fragments. The geographer, who insists that violence has an address, that the difference between a peaceful valley and a raiding culture 20 miles away is not statistical noise, but the thing itself. The essayist, who watches what we do with inconvenient evidence and asks whether our interpretation of the deep past is doing work in the present we have not admitted. What is at stake is not whether prehistoric life was nasty, brutish, and short. That is Hobbes, and Hobbes had never seen a prehistoric skeleton. What is at stake is whether the Leviathan we live inside can justify itself by pointing backward, or whether the case for the state must be made on other grounds entirely. We are speaking in 2026. We have lived through 2 decades in which states have failed, held, metastasized, and in some places begun to fray at the edges. The question of what kind of violence the state prevents and what kind it generates is not academic. Empiricist, you have the floor.
The first question is not whether prehistoric violence was common. Keeley's skeletal surveys from sites across the Danubian Neolithic, the American Southwest, and Polynesia are methodologically sound as far as they go. The first question is what population we are sampling. If you survey cemeteries near fortified settlements, you will find evidence of fortified settlements. Crow Creek in South Dakota, 1325 AD. Nearly 500 bodies in a mass grave, evidence of scalping, mutilation, defensive palisades burned. But Crow Creek was not a random village. It was a refuge site during the collapse of Cahokian political order. Sampling it tells you what happens when large-scale societies fragment. It does not tell you what life was like in the centuries before anyone built Cahokia. The bias runs deeper than geography. Skeletal remains preserve where conditions permit, typically in dry caves or limestone sites that already select for non-coastal, non-tropical populations. We have excellent bone records from the inland Southwest and almost none from the Pacific Northwest, where salmon abundance supported dense populations who left their dead to the forest. The archaeological record is not a representative sample of human experience. It is a record of who happened to die where bones last. Pinker's chart showing declining violence from prehistory to modernity rests on a denominator problem. The 15% figure comes from adding together all violent deaths at all sites, then dividing by all individuals at those sites. But the temporal range spans 12,000 years and 5 continents. The method assumes that violence rates are a stable property of pre-state societies rather than highly variable responses to specific ecological and political conditions, drought, resource collapse, slave raiding by neighboring states. Here is the test that would settle it. Find a region with continuous occupation across the agricultural transition, say the Levant, from 12,000 to 6,000 years ago, and compare violence rates in the same location before and after sedentism. If violence is intrinsic to statelessness, it should appear at high rates throughout. If it appears only after settlement nucleation and surplus accumulation, the causal arrow points the other direction. The evidence we have shows exactly that pattern. Pre-agricultural Natufian sites in the Levant show trauma rates below 3%. Early agricultural sites show rates climbing to 12% as population density rises and mobility declines. The state does not arrive to pacify pre-existing violence. The conditions that produce states produce the violence the state then claims to solve.
The empiricist is correct that the crucial variable is the shift to agriculture. But to say that the conditions producing states also produce violence is to mistake the map for the territory. The map shows a neat line between forager and farmer. The territory was a violent 1,000-year frontier. Violence is not a uniform property of a historical stage, it is a feature of a specific geography, the contested border. Consider the Neckar River Valley near modern Heilbronn, Germany, around 5000 BC. The Talheim death pit contains the remains of 34 individuals, men, women, and children of a single farming community, executed with the distinctive adzes of their farming neighbors and thrown into a mass grave. This was not a clash between hunter-gatherers and the vanguard of the Neolithic. This was a war for arable land between two settled groups. The state did not arrive to pacify this. This was the process of state formation, played out in blood over one fertile valley. The choice was never between a peaceful foraging life and a violent farming one. For most, there was no choice. The expansion of farming populations was a slow, inexorable process of displacement. This is a recurring pattern, a kind of ecological succession where one human system replaces another. It happened in Europe, it happened with the Bantu expansion across sub-Saharan Africa. The skeletal record is not showing us a uniform pre-state condition. It is showing us the moments of greatest friction at the edge of an expanding system. This frontier has never fully closed. Think of a man named Dida, a Borana pastoralist living today across the Kenya-Ethiopia border, a line drawn by people who had never seen his grazing lands. His wealth, his social standing, his entire world is expressed in the health of his cattle. But the rangelands are shrinking, partly due to climate change, partly due to the encroachment of settled agriculture encouraged by both governments. When drought hits, as it did severely in 2022, his neighbors, the Geographer, raid his herds. He raids them back. The Kenyan state calls him a criminal. The Ethiopian state calls him an inconvenient nomad. He is caught between a world of mobility and a world of fixed property. The violence in his life is not a relic of a time before the state. It is a product of the state's clumsy, incomplete arrival. What both sides of this argument quietly ignore is this zone of transition. They speak of the stateless and the state, but the reality for most of human history, and for many people today, is the deadly space in between.
The shared assumption is that populations treat the state's monopoly on legitimate violence as an accomplished fact rather than a service they can and do withdraw from when its costs exceed its returns. Both positions measure violence only through the state's own records and categories, which leaves unexamined the growing number of people who are quietly moving their protection arrangements outside those categories altogether. In the United States, the number of concealed carry permits has risen from roughly 4 million active permits around 2000 to more than 17 million by the early 2020s, according to compilations by the Crime Prevention Research Center. Private security employment, tracked by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, increased more than 40% between 2010 and 2022, even while national homicide rates remained below their early 1990s peaks. These are not marginal adjustments. They represent households and firms reallocating resources away from tax-funded policing toward direct purchase of armed presence. Where clearance rates for violent crime have fallen below 30% in several large American cities, the substitution effect is measurable in insurance premiums and security budgets rather than in official statistics. The same pattern appeared in the late Western Roman Empire after the 3rd century crises. Landowners in Gaul and Italy stopped relying on distant legions and instead maintained private bucellarii and fortified estates. The imperial state continued to claim sole authority, yet the actual provision of security had already shifted to local arrangements that later hardened into the manorial system. The behavioral signal was identical. People stopped waiting for the center to restore order and began paying for order directly. What the data show is, therefore, not a debate over prehistoric baselines, but an active unbundling of the state's oldest function. When millions of citizens treat personal armament and private security as ordinary household expenses, they are revealing that the state's performance on violence is being judged in real time against alternatives rather than accepted as the necessary price of order. You claim that the conditions that produce states produce the violence the state then claims to solve. Which observable pattern in the skeletal or settlement record would falsify that causal direction by showing violence declining after the appearance of central institutions rather than rising with them?
The best evidence would be a region with continuous central authority showing declining trauma rates over time, controlled for record-keeping improvements. The Maya lowlands, 250 to 900 AD, show the opposite. Trauma indicators show variation across classic and terminal classic contexts as state institutions fragment, though precise site-level rates remain debated in the bioarchaeological literature. But you have caught me in an overstatement. The claim should not be that violence always rises with state formation, but that early state formation concentrates violence at specific nodes where surplus extraction meets resistance. The Andes provide the cleaner test. Wari Empire expansion into the Ayacucho Basin, roughly 600 to 800 AD, shows something unexpected. Trauma rates in Wari-affiliated communities show variation under imperial administration, with studies of AD 650 to 800 populations documenting differential skeletal trauma patterns across incorporated and non-incorporated groups, while rising sharply in frontier zones still being contested. The falsifying pattern exists. States that successfully monopolize violence do reduce it locally, but they export it to their peripheries and to the process of expansion itself. Your question: if state capacity is the mechanism that reduces violence, why does your own evidence show violence rising fastest where states are growing, not failing? You say that the violence documented across these borderland communities is a product of the state's clumsy, incomplete arrival, that these populations inhabit a transitional zone where state authority has not yet solidified. But consider the newer Dinka cattle raids of the Upper Nile Basin, which were extensively recorded by E. Evans Pritchard in the 1930s and traced by him back through oral history well beyond any colonial administrative presence. Or the Afar-Somali conflicts along the Awash Corridor, which predate the Ethiopian imperial frontier by generations and have persisted through Haile Selassie's centralization campaigns, through the Derg's militarized collectivization, through the post-1991 fragmentation. If the violence persists across a century of increasing state penetration, roads built, police posts established, administrative districts carved, at what point does incomplete arrival become the equilibrium condition rather than a temporary phase? What evidence would convince you that some ecologies generate persistent violence regardless of state capacity rather than violence that awaits pacification?
You have caught me in an overstatement. To describe the violence of the Karamojong cluster as a product of the state's clumsy arrival is to ignore a deep history of reciprocal raiding. I concede the point, but the state is not an innocent bystander. It has transformed a limited practice into a commercial enterprise. The critical variable is the Kalashnikov, which flooded this region after 1979, a direct consequence of the fall of Amin's regime in Uganda and the spillage from the war in the Ogaden. An elder near Kotito will tell you he raided with spears for honor. His grandsons raid with assault rifles for cash from urban brokers. The state's failure next door supplied the tools, and its economic arteries supplied the motive to make an old conflict unrecognizably lethal. It is a grimly modern hybrid. This brings the question back to your own evidence. Your Wari and Maya data rely on skeletal trauma, a metric stable across millennia. But consider what the colonial pacification of the American plains actually produced. Not the elimination of Lakota warfare, but its compression into a reservation geography where the violence turned inward. Homicide rates among confined populations spiking precisely as interband raiding was suppressed. The lethal energy did not dissipate, it redistributed. If the modern state's primary effect is to change the topology of violence rather than its volume, does your focus on incidence rates not miss the fundamental transformation of the act itself? You speak of households and firms substituting private security for a failing state service, as if they are switching providers for electricity. But what of the lime grower in Apatzingan in Michoacan? He pays a war tax to the local cartel. In return, he is not attacked by them, and they may even kill rivals who try to move in on his territory. Is this the unbundling of a state monopoly on violence, or is it simply the emergence of a rival monopoly, one that offers protection from a threat it manufactures itself?
Your question forces the necessary distinction between extraction that manufactures its own demand and substitution that occurs where exit remains possible. The cartel arrangement is the former. The grower cannot credibly threaten to switch providers without facing manufactured retaliation, so the payment functions as tribute rather than a tested contract. Yet the same logic does not collapse all private arrangements into protection rackets. Where legal markets for security operate under residual state enforcement, households can and do compare response times, costs, and reliability across options without risking asset seizure or murder. The behavioral signal worth tracking is therefore not the existence of payment itself, but whether payers retain the capacity to withdraw it.
The question beneath the question is this: are we arguing about whether violence declines under state authority, or are we avoiding the recognition that what declines is unauthorized violence, while what rises, hidden inside the category of law, of border enforcement, of legitimate force, is the kind we have agreed not to count? We are speaking in 2026. The United States has returned approximately 11 million people to their countries of origin since 2001, under a system of administrative removal that operates largely outside criminal courts. The European Union has externalized border enforcement to Libya, where the UN documented systematic torture in detention centers funded by EU migration control budgets. These are not rogue operations, they are policy. So the question is not whether DITA's cattle raid counts as violence, while the state's deportation machinery does not. The question is whether we are the kind of people who can look directly at the apparatus we have built and see it as the thing itself, not as the alternative to violence, but as violence successfully reclassified. Are we inside the transition the geographer described, or have we invented a language that lets us mistake arrival for completion?
People accept state violence when it targets outsiders they already fear and seek private substitutes only when the state turns its attention inward or proves indifferent. In Japan, where firearms ownership is among the lowest in the world, private security employment has grown by roughly 30% over the past 2 decades, even as street crime remains statistically negligible because corporate clients no longer trust police responsiveness to white-collar and property disputes. At the same time, Internal Revenue Service data show that civil penalties and interest charges levied against wage earners without recourse to jury trial recovered over $14 billion in a single recent fiscal year, and administrative extraction structurally prior to any finding of wrongdoing, yet it produces far less organized resistance than equivalent sums taken by street criminals. These patterns reveal the coercive asymmetry at the heart of modern governance more sharply than any prehistoric bone count. When payers can move their assets, their households, or their labor across jurisdictions freely, they treat security as one commodity among others, comparing providers and switching when dissatisfied. When mobility is effectively foreclosed by licensing regimes, residency requirements, or sheer poverty, the payment becomes indistinguishable from the threat it nominally resolves. The state's advantage is not that it diminishes harm in the aggregate, but that it authors the taxonomy of permissible force, and for those without the resources to contest that taxonomy, the authored version simply becomes the only version available.
The essayist is correct that a subject who cannot leave is not a party to a contract. But what marks the boundary is not merely the locked gate, it is the erasure of the ground beneath the feet, the declaration that the place where you stand has been administratively unmade. Consider the coalfields of the South Welsh valleys in the 1980s. The violence of deindustrialization was not the baton of the police line at Orgreave, though that was real enough. It was the closure notice pinned to the colliery gates, the geological survey quietly reclassifying the seams as uneconomic, the planning designation that turned a working community into a zone of managed decline. The state was not absent. It was operating with tremendous structural force, redirecting capital toward the service economy of the Southeast, building infrastructure for one England while allowing another to subside. In a terrace in Merthyr Tydfil, a man I will call Gareth sits filling in another form for the job center. No one has come for him with a weapon. The violence is the community center padlocked for want of council funding. It is the reclassification of his skill set as obsolete. It is the measured language of the white paper that described what happened to his town as a transition. Gareth is not paying tribute to a warlord. He is paying the price of someone else's growth dividend, the cost of keeping a different economy solvent. The state has not failed him. It has sacrificed him. Its machinery is working perfectly. The violence we have learned not to count is not the heat of the raid, but the cool, deliberate pressure of the blueprint. It leaves no perimortem fractures on the bone. It simply removes the man, his house, and his livelihood from the future map. Look at his hands. He is filling in forms for work that, for him, will never come.
The falsification standard I proposed, find declining violence after state formation in a single location, survives none of the evidence this debate has produced. Consider the Valley of Oaxaca sequence, where bioarchaeological data shows cranial trauma rates falling in Monte Alban's core settlements across its classic period expansion. The violence did not disappear. The Zapotec state was simultaneously raiding and incorporating surrounding polities, as the trophy skull deposits at conquest sites make plain. Reduced trauma in the capital and increased trauma at the frontier is not pacification. It is a ledger with two columns, and the accounting only works if you read one of them. Here is what that implies for measurement. The global burden of disease study tracks homicide as a discrete cause of death, roughly 400,000 deaths globally in recent years. But the same data set records approximately 1.2 million tuberculosis deaths annually, a disease whose transmission accelerates in conditions of urban crowding, malnutrition, and inadequate housing. TB was rare among mobile foraging populations with low density and diverse protein sources. It became epidemic only after settlement nucleation created the ecological conditions for sustained human-to-human transmission. We do not classify those deaths as violence because no individual holds the weapon. But if the state's core function is to concentrate populations for taxation and labor extraction, and that concentration predictably generates disease burdens that would not otherwise exist, then the causal chain is not hidden. It is simply category shifting. The state did not arrive to solve the TB problem. State formation created the TB problem, then developed public health as a partial remedy for harms intrinsic to its own operation. The question is not whether violence declines when you compare modern Stockholm to a Neolithic mass grave. The question is whether we are measuring comparable things or whether one set of deaths comes with a perpetrator we can name and the other comes with a system we have agreed not to blame. What this debate has clarified is not that Pinker is wrong about the trend, but that the trend measures only the violence we have decided counts.